Welcome back to the deep dive. You give us the sources, we build your shortcut to knowledge. Today, we're really diving deep into something that kind of flips the script on what therapy even is. You know, most people, probably even you listening, assume psychoanalysis is mainly about the words spoken, the interpretation, the insight.
Right, the talking cure.
Exactly. But the sources we have today, they focus on this pretty radical idea that maybe the most critical, the most life-altering communication in therapy, it often happens through action.
That's it. It's the therapy communicated by what isn't said verbally, or maybe by what's deliberately done.
Okay.
So our mission today is really to unpack this concept called interpretive action. We're looking at how an analyst actually conveys a deep understanding of unconscious meaning using activity, things other than just words.
Activity like what exactly?
Well, it could be silence, a gesture, even how they structure the session, not just relying on verbal symbolization. It's about the analyst sort of saying themselves in speech they do not speak.
Okay, interesting. And we're going to use some pretty intense clinical stories, some vignettes from the sources, to really bring this to life. Cases where, honestly, the patient's issues were so deep, so tangled up in the act of speaking itself, that words alone just weren't working.
Exactly. Get ready for some surprising insights into silence, refusal, and ambiguity as like high-stakes therapeutic tools.
All right, let's get into it. Section 1. Defining this invisible interpretation. Okay, so let's set the baseline first. The sources are pretty clear. The analysand, the patient, they already communicate deep unconscious stuff through action.
Right. We see that all the time. Things like enactments, where the patient acts out a whole fantasy instead of remembering it, or projective identifications. They're acting out the problem.
So the patient is acting.
Precisely. The patient communicates through action. But the breakthrough idea here is that the analyst often needs to respond in kind. Interpretive action is the analyst communicating their understanding of that whole transference-countertransference dynamic.
Whoa, okay, hold on. Let's pause on that jargon for a sec, for you listening. Transference, countertransference. We hear that a lot in these psychoanalytic sources. Can you give us a quick working definition of that emotional field?
Sure. Think of it like the emotional weather in the therapy room. It's constantly shifting. Transference is the patient, unconsciously, putting old feelings and patterns, often from childhood, parents, onto the analyst.
Okay.
And countertransference is the analyst's total reaction to that, conscious, unconscious, all of it. So interpretive action means showing you understand that specific shared tension, especially when words just aren't getting through.
Right. So why is action needed then? If the analyst figures out, okay, this person's treating me like their critical mother, why not just say that? Are you saying verbal interpretations are like useless in these tough cases?
Not useless, no, but sometimes they're temporarily silenced, you could say.
Yeah.
When a patient has a really rigid, highly organized defense system, they can basically take every word the analyst says and twist it, use it as part of the defense itself.
So the words get incorporated into the problem.
Exactly. Verbal interpretation alone just cannot break through sometimes. The power of interpretive action is that it can communicate understanding precisely when that language pathway is jammed up or even weaponized by the patient.
Okay.
But this is really crucial. The action isn't just random. The sources hammer this point. Action by itself is meaningless. Its specific meaning comes from what they call the intersubjective analytic third.
Okay, another term we need to ground. What's the intersubjective analytic third? Sounds complex.
It does, but think of it like this. It's the unique shared reality, or maybe the distinct relationship flavor, that only exists because these two specific people are interacting in that room.
Ah, okay, so it's unique to that pair.
Right. The meaning of the analyst's silence, for instance, isn't some universal code. It gets its meaning from the analyst's specific reaction, their countertransference, to the patient's specific pattern. The action works because it speaks directly into that shared intersubjective space.
That helps a lot. And the ways this action happens are pretty varied, you said. It could be a look on the analyst's face, or silence, or even what the sources call verbal action, using the voice but not like a content interpretation.
Precisely. Verbal action could be simply announcing the end of the session on time, or setting the fee, or even insisting firmly that the patient needs to stop a certain behavior in the room. These are all actions that carry a specific unconscious meaning within that charged relationship field. It's targeted, it's not just about creating a generally nice, warm, mutative emotional climate. It's about conveying a precise, nonverbal piece of understanding about what's happening between them right then and there.
Okay, to really grasp how radical this is, we need to look at cases where talking therapy just hit a wall. Let's dive into the first case study. Dr. M. She was a research scientist.
Right. And she was really plagued by this deep anxiety that her whole career was basically a sham. She felt she only succeeded by, piecing together bits of information she'd sort of gleaned or extracted from her colleagues.
A feeling of being an intellectual thief.
Exactly. And this fear of stealing, this dynamic, it bled into her most intimate life too, psychologically, sexually. The source mentions she found pleasure in arousing her husband, but then consciously fantasized that she was successfully stealing his erect penis.
Wow.
Yeah. She'd observed the scene almost from a distance in her mind, feeling triumphant about acquiring this borrowed power.
That's an incredibly vivid picture of, appropriation and this profound sense of greed almost.
It is. And this core pathology, this what the source calls a perversion of language and thought, it completely defined her analysis. She didn't talk to reflect or understand herself.
No. Why did she talk then?
She spoke only to get the analyst to talk. She even kept a journal, but she consciously only wrote down the analyst's comments, the interpretations.
Why?
She saw the analyst's words as magical things, like borrowed strength, like spells she could capture, but they lost their power the moment she wrote them down. They were immediately used up.
So if the analyst gave a really insightful interpretation, she didn't use it for growth. She felt like she'd successfully tricked or seduced the analyst into giving it to her.
Precisely. It just confirmed her inner fantasy of being this greedy thief of thoughts and power.
Oh man, so every single verbal interpretation, even if the analyst tried to interpret that specific dynamic,
It got swallowed instantly, incorporated right back into the perverse fantasy. The analyst's words were systematically made ineffective, just feeding the very system they were trying to understand and change.
so talking was actually making it worse in a way. What was the solution then? How did they break that cycle?
The shift came through the analyst's own feelings, the countertransference. The analyst started feeling less of the anger and frustration of being manipulated and more this deep shared sense of sadness and despair.
A shift in the emotional weather you mentioned.
Exactly, and that feeling contributed to the decision to use action. So one day, Dr. M starts firing off these angry, provocative questions, really demanding answers, demanding knowledge from the analyst.
Trying to extract more spells.
Right. And instead of answering or interpreting the demand, the analyst responded with silence.
Just silence.
Well, not just any silence. The source says it was intense. It had an unmistakably different quality from just a pause. The analyst's internal thought, the interpretation they didn't speak, was something like this. You know, these questions are really an angry accusation that I'm excluding you. And if I answer, I'm just confirming your belief that you're enslaved, dependent on my spells.
Okay.
So the silence itself became the interpretation, an action that existed outside her usual way of twisting language.
And the result? Did it work?
The result was immediate and incredible. Dr. M stopped demanding answers. She started looking around the room, and she said the office looked like it's been moving laterally.
Moving laterally, like sideways.
Yeah, a fascinating phrase, right? A kind of pun suggesting maybe psychological movement, but also a break from her very concrete, literal way of thinking.
And did anything else change?
Yes. The material that came next showed real inner life starting to emerge. She reported her first vivid dream in a long time, and slips of the tongue started appearing like, she'd say powder when she meant power, talking about her excitement.
Wow. Small things, but significant.
Huge. The silence, that nonverbal action, had successfully expanded the analytic space, creating room for actual thinking and internal experience to happen, instead of just the repetitive enactment.
Okay, so that shows how not acting, how silence can be a powerful interpretation, creating space. Now let's shift gears to a different kind of interpretive action. A really clear, specific refusal.
Right. Let's meet Mr. P. He walks into his very first session looking, as the source says, absolutely broken, consumed by this intensely passionate affair he was having with his best friend's wife.
Okay, high drama from the start.
Absolutely. And the first thing he does, he immediately hands the analyst a sheaf of love poems he'd written, a very literal gesture, just flooding the room with this feeling of, abject surrender and desperation.
Handing over the evidence, almost.
Kind of. And the analyst's countertransference reading was like lightning. They instantly sensed this was an invitation into a very specific kind of drama, a sadomasochistic homosexual scene.
Wait, hang on. He hands over love poems about an affair with a woman, conveying surrender, and the analyst immediately thinks sadomasochistic homosexual scene. That feels like a huge leap. How did they get there so fast?
It does sound like a leap, but remember that charged transference field. The analyst felt, in that moment, that if they accepted those poems, they'd be forced into one of two roles, either sadistically using the poems against him, holding power over his vulnerability, or masochistically submitting to having this raw, uncontrolled passion just dumped onto them.
Okay, I see the S&M dynamic there, the power play, but the homosexual element.
The analyst's immediate internal hypothesis, which they'd obviously explore later, was that the affair itself might be an unconscious enactment, a way for Mr. P to, symbolically, put his penis where his friend's penis, maybe representing a father figures, have been, trying to achieve a kind of forbidden intimacy, maybe even with a father figure, while consciously keeping it focused on the woman to avoid facing the homosexual feelings directly.
Right, okay. That's deep psychoanalytic territory, but I see the logic within that framework. So, faced with this intense moment, this gift of poems, what was the interpretive action?
The analyst responded with what sounds like a gentle verbal action, but its core function was a nonverbal refusal. They said something like, it would take some time to understand something of what had just transpired between us. And so I suggested that he keep the poems for now.
Ah, so they didn't take the poems.
They didn't take them. And this wasn't just, generic boundary setting like we don't accept gifts based on the analyst's instant hypothesis about the underlying fantasy.
A homosexual S&M fantasy.
Right. The refusal was an immediate, maybe tentative communication of the analyst's understanding of that fantasy. It was a refusal to participate in that specific enactment being offered through the poems. It acknowledged the intensity, the desperation to evacuate this destructive passion into the analyst.
So the refusal itself was the interpretation in that moment,
Yeah.
blocking the enactment before it could fully take hold.
Exactly. It created a necessary psychological space right there in the first session. A space for Mr. P to hopefully start thinking about this compulsion, rather than just acting it out and dumping it onto the analyst. By refusing the poems, by making them an analytic object, something to be understood together later, rather than just surrendered property, the analyst communicated the core issue, the transference-countertransference dynamic, way before a complex spoken interpretation could even be formulated, let alone heard.
Okay, fascinating. So we've had silence, we've had refusal. Our final example from the sources involves an interpretive action that actually looks like a question, but a very ambiguous one. And this deals with that fuzzy area between reality and fantasy. Transitional phenomena.
That's right. Transitional phenomena, Winnicott's idea, that crucial intermediate space. So let's meet Ms. D, a highly intelligent woman, but really crippled by phobias and finding it hard to think clearly.
Okay.
And she was wrestling with this core unconscious fantasy. The idea of secretly, excitedly, kind of sneaking into the parental bedroom, which, in the analysis, symbolized the private analytic space, the analyst's mind, maybe their relationship. This fantasy was tied up with intense shame for her.
Right, the forbidden zone.
Exactly. Now, the analyst, Dr. L in this case, actually decided to give Ms. D one of her published articles to read, sort of deliberately inviting her into that parental discourse, you could say.
Okay, interesting move by the analyst. So Misty reads the article, comes back to the session, and asks for clarification on some terms in it, which, sounds like a perfectly normal, reasonable question.
It does on the surface. But context is everything, right? Given the underlying fantasy about secretly entering the analyst's private world, the latent meaning of the question was thick with that shame and excitement. Dr. L felt this tension, this unspoken charge in the room.
Yeah.
And spontaneously, she just asked, what would you like to know?
What would you like to know? Okay. How did that become an interpretation?
Through its ambiguity. The source says both the analyst and Misty immediately became aware that the question could be read in two ways.
How so?
Well, did Dr. Lemine tell me what terms you're asking about, and I'll explain them, signaling she would answer, granting full access? Or did she mean something more like, what is the nature of your wish to know? What's driving this question for you? Just inquiring about the desire itself.
Ah, okay. So it hung there, unresolved.
Exactly. The question itself became a paradox. And that paradox functioned as a transitional phenomenon. It was emotionally charged, really important, but it was maintained without being collapsed into a simple answer.
Why is keeping it ambiguous better than just answering the question? Why not just say, okay, let's clarify that term?
Because giving a straight answer in this specific context would have likely just shut down the creative tension. It might have gratified the surface request, but ignored the deeper, more fraught fantasy underneath about accessing the forbidden parental analytic space.
Okay.
The ambiguous question, instead, safely recreated that whole primal scene, the Oedipal drama, but in a way that was manageable. It non-verbally conveyed the understanding that the latent question, do you really want access to the private intercourse, the private thoughts of your parent's analyst, didn't actually need a final yes or no answer.
It created space for her to just feel the question, maybe.
Precisely. Space to feel the compulsion, the wish, the shame, the excitement, without having to immediately act on it or get a concrete answer that would shut down the exploration. It created a safe space for her to experience that tension and maybe begin to think about it imaginatively.
And what happened with Mrs. D?
The effect was quite profound. She was startled by the ambiguous question, paused, and then said the answers didn't really seem to matter anymore. And significantly, she didn't then compulsively try to find more of the analyst's private work or writings.
So a shift.
A real psychological shift. Away from compulsive action, needing to get the answer, get inside, towards potentially more imaginative thought about the desire itself. But the source adds a really important caution here.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
Even when using this kind of spontaneous action, this spontaneous gesture of the analytic third, as they call it, the analyst must still consistently formulate the interpretation in words for themselves internally.
Why? If the action worked, why the internal check?
To make sure it doesn't just become impulsive acting out by the analyst. To ensure it's not just a rationalization for avoiding a difficult verbal interpretation. The action needs to be grounded in and informed by a thoughtful understanding of the countertransference, even if the action itself comes first before it's spoken to the patient. It keeps the analyst honest, basically. Hashtag wrap up in relevance.
Wow, what a fascinating journey through the unspoken language of the therapy room. We've seen silence break a destructive loop, refusal to find boundaries against a specific fantasy, and ambiguity turn a compulsion into a space for thought.
Yeah, the core takeaway, I think, for you listening is that interpretation isn't just about the sentences spoken out loud. It's really an emergent understanding of the most difficult conflicts playing out between two people. And it's communicated through the whole interaction, especially when the patient's defenses make words useless or even turn them into weapons.
And this idea, it really applies way beyond the consulting room, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Anytime you're in a situation with high stakes, where there are conflicts that are hard to talk about directly, maybe a tricky negotiation at work, a tense family talk, any really deep human interaction, you can be pretty sure that your actions or your deliberate non-actions, your silences, are speaking volumes. They're often communicating the underlying meaning that the words themselves are being used to cover up or avoid.
That's a powerful thought, that our actions are interpreting the situation, even if we don't realize it.
Indeed. So, maybe a final thought to leave you with. If every intense relationship involved this kind of interpretation, where we convey our understanding of unspoken stuff through how we relate, where in your own life are your most honest, maybe most difficult understandings being communicated? Not by what you say, but by the actions or perhaps the deliberate silences that you choose.
Something to definitely think about as you navigate your own conversations. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.